Anyway, Penn State in the 80s. I hope you like my 1980s background there. Come on, there we go. Now, what I'm going to talk about is the 1980s in general, myths, that sort of thing, and also about the 1980s here at Penn State. For those of you who aren't here, that's where I am now. I'm going to go over some basic LGBT terms, and then I'm going to talk about Penn State LGB, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, but also covers various other things in the 1980s. And then I'm going to talk about Penn State transgender in the 1980s. So the 80s, it seems to me that lately a lot of the undergrads and a lot of people are still pretty, I won't say obsessed with the 80s, but people are really into it. And I don't blame them. I mean, there was the bright colors, the music was amazing, there were great movies. Wow. I mean, but if you ever go to an 80s party, everyone's in the neon and they're in pastels and they bring their Rubik's cubes and that sort of thing. There's the era of Madonna, Michael Jackson. Wow, the 80s were great, weren't they? And being that they were, now 40 years ago, those of us who lived through them do remember some different things about the 80s. However, you got to talk about the tunes when you talk about the 80s. You got to talk about punk. You got to talk about new wave. You got to talk about the new romantics. You got to talk about the birth of rap. Oh, the birth of MTV, Michael Jackson's Thriller selling so many copies, that sort of thing. Important to remember that in the music and that sort of culture, suddenly androgyny was a big deal. As you can see here, there's Boy George with Culture Club. He definitely went for androgynous. Eurythmics, the entire New Romantics movement were all about, gender bending and that sort of thing, which makes some of the things I'm going to say sound, well, hypocritical, really. But I will still maintain until something comes along that's better that 80s music is still the best music out there. Sorry, guys. Get off my lawn. Somebody's clunking around out there. Now, what was it really like? Well, all those things you saw were true. They all happened. But the neon part, well, I mean, I think that was only a fad for like a hot minute, maybe 6 months tops. If you want to know how we dressed in the 80s, watch The Breakfast Club. That's how we dressed in the 80s. Most of us were in t-shirts and jeans, that sort of thing, at least for the guys. And for the girls, there were styles going around like the off the shoulder and that sort of thing. But one of the key aspects of the 80s was that here in the United States, we had this feeling of impending doom. There were the idea that nuclear Armageddon was there was constant. We knew it could happen. We had Ronald Reagan in office, the shining city on the hill, but he also was very tough talking about the Soviets. He was, this is back in the Soviet Union, the evil empire, he called them. And in fact, he was going to bring up something he called Star Wars. Star Wars was a laser satellite grid, if you will, which would knock down any nuclear missiles. It never worked. It never got in the air. But the Russians believed that it would. And so when the Russians with the Soviets, they didn't like that because they knew that if you put lasers in space, you could put other things in space. So that was a big problem. Also in the 80s, you had a lot of problems with the environment. You had the Love Canal going on, which was, they had a bunch of, a chemical company would dump all kinds of chemicals into the water and not tell anyone about it. And it became something called a Superfund site. Superfund was started to clean all that up. Also in the news, there were boycotts of the Olympics, both from us in 1980 and from the Soviets in 1984. There was terrorism. Things were blowing up all over the place. It seemed like every week there was a plane being hijacked or blown up. In the lower right, you see a picture from Lockerbie, Scotland. 747 was blown out of the sky over Scotland. There was a bomb on board. It was later determined it was a Libyan who did it. Many people died, including a lot of Syracuse students who were coming home for Christmas break. This happened near Christmas. There were no survivors. Speaking of explosions, right in the middle, you see the space shuttle. The space shuttle blew up in late January of 1986. This was the Challenger. And the entire crew were killed, and they found that was due to a faulty O-ring. But up to that time, that was the major event of my generation, the Generation X, that we all can remember where we were. Just like now we can say 9/11 and that sort of thing. But that was the first. And in fact, that day was the day I decided to become a teacher. Above that, of course, we had in the LGBT realm of things, AIDS. AIDS started in the late 70s, early 80s, and nothing was done about it here in America pretty much because Reagan called it the gay disease. And in fact, his press secretary made a joke out of it. And because it was thought to be a gay disease, no one did anything about it. And thousands died, horrible deaths. Eventually, the stigma was taken away because celebrities started dying, like Rock Hudson, Liberace, Freddie Mercury of Queen. Now, HIV, which is the disease that causes AIDS, is under control. Magic Johnson's had it for decades, and he hasn't infected anyone. People are now able to survive with this. But all this mixed in with the 80s. The picture in the upper right is Bud Dwyer. Bud Dwyer was the treasurer of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania who shot himself on live TV in 1986. Or was it 87? One or the other, doesn't matter. You can now get the entire thing on TV or on YouTube, but you couldn't for many years. So the 80s was a combination of all these bright things, all these great music and that sort of thing, but there's that edge. You never knew if you were going to live the next day because you never knew if there was going to be nuclear Armageddon. There was a TV show came out in the 80s, I believe it was in 84, called The Day After. And it was after seeing the show, which showed very graphically the aftermath of nuclear war, that President Reagan decided he's going to do something about reducing the nuclear arms, and he did. So what was it like in the 80s in Penn State? Well, it was paradise. It was Fantasyland. Penn State then was known for having 2 national championships in football in both 1982 and 1986. 1986 was my first year here at Penn State, and the fact that we had a national championship my first year, oh my goodness, that was incredible. Down the bottom, you see that there's a picture of Beaver Stadium at the time. The music here in State College was incredible. The fraternity, the Greek scene was incredible. I could go on and on. It seemed like it was a fantasy land. However, it was a fantasy land for only so many people if you were heterosexual. But we'll get to that. Before I go further, I'm going to go over a few terms. I would guess that most of you know these, but if you don't, well, that's fine too. This was created by the Center for Sexual and Gender Equality here at Penn State. And this is based on something called either the gender unicorn or the genderbread man. And I'm going to go over some things very quickly. The first one is sex. Well, we all know what sex is, right? Sex assigned at birth is you came out of your mother, or however, the doctor looked between your legs and said, boy, girl. And it very rarely would say intersex, which used to be known as hermaphrodite, that sort of thing. That's sex. Then there's gender. Gender and sex are 2 different things. Start with gender identity. gender identity is in the brain, as you can see by this picture. Usually, 99% of the time, if you're born with sex male, then your gender identity is male. If you're born as a female and female, there you go. That is known as cisgender. That means cis, Greek for same. So cis, same gender. If you're born a boy, you feel like a boy, everything's great. But then there are people who aren't born that way. They are called transgender. I am transgender. I've known this since I was 4 years old. I was born with a sex assigned male, but I've known since I was 4 that I was a female. And what people can do about that is, for a long time, you couldn't do anything. And we'll get to that about the 80s and that sort of thing. I transitioned 6 years ago. I started taking hormones under a doctor's care and I am now legally female. So everything about me says female in, legally and that sort of thing. That's gender identity. That's who you are inside. Then there's gender expression. That's how you dress. For example, if I wear a dress outside, I'm showing and expressing female. If I'm wearing, my hat on, I've got this hat on, I've got jeans, and I'm expressing male, I can do that. And then there's in between. That's also known as genderqueer, or there's a lot of terms for it now. But you can dress anywhere between extremely masculine to extremely feminine. You can identify extremely masculine to extremely feminine. There is no binary. None. It is a continuum. You can fall anywhere on that continuum. Then comes into who you're physically attracted to. Your gender identity and your sexual identity are two different things, and they are independent. Physically attracted to is who you are attracted to. For example, a man who wants to sleep with a woman is hetero. A woman who wants to sleep with a man is hetero. But there's also men wanting to be with men wanting to be with women. All those different combinations are possible. That's who you're attracted to. Emotionally attracted to is who you love. So you could be physically attracted to, you could be a man physically attracted to women, but you fall in love with both, men or women. Every different possible combination are there. So with that in mind, any questions at this particular point? I know I've been rambling. Bueller? Okay, moving on. So what was it like for Penn State LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual questioning in the 80s? It wasn't easy. On the right, you see that in the beginning of the 80s here at University Park, 33,813 enrolled. According to Stanford University, approximately 10% of the population are lesbian, gay, bisexual. So there's your numbers of 3381. And again, according to Stanford, at maximum, there are 1% of the population are transgender. However, there are new estimates saying it's up to 3%. I'm going to stick with Stanford's 1 because it's easy for math. By the end of the decade, we had 37,000 people up here. Possible LGBT, 3,700. Possible transgender, 376. As you can see in that picture from 1983, that's from the Daily Collegian, which is a newspaper here if you didn't know. And they talk about the social scene and support groups. The social scene in the 70s here was actually better than the 80s. They had bars they could go to. In the 80s, not so much. Also in the 80s, it was a conservative administration in the Reagan administration. And remember, there was the gay aid, the gay plague out there. So people were stigmatizing LGBT. These are all from the Daily Collegian, both 1986 and 1987, 1983. You see that live in fear of violence. That 72% have been verbally insulted. This is from a survey that was put together. I'll come back with that. You come back to this survey. 22% have been chased or followed, 16% personal property damage, 25% threatened with physical violence, 6% have been spat upon. That's here at Penn State. On the right, the collegian talks about the Bible and how homosexuality is a choice and how it's immoral. They thought it was a choice, but it isn't. It's biological. All of LGBT is biological. We are born this way. Who would choose it if you think about it? A life of being spat upon, 72% verbally insulted? Who would choose that? Nobody would. However, it wasn't all darkness and horrible. As a response to that article, you see celebrating diversity and humanity. There were people here who would also speak to saying, hey, look, it's none of your business. And here you see this again from 1986 about the gays and lesbians wanting equal status because there wasn't any. When I was here from 1986 to 1989, there were 2 places a lesbian, gay, bisexual person could go. There was a bar called Chumley's, which is still here. And that was a gay bar. Everyone knew it. That was, that's for gay people. Also, not so well known outside of the community was a place called Mr. C's. Now that's a dance club. It still operates when there's not a plague going on. It's gone through many names, Players, Indigo. Eric, do you have any idea what it's called now?
No
I'm
idea.
sure it's called the Basement.
The Basement now? Thank you. But back then it was Mr. C's. And that word got around that Monday night at Mr. C's, kind of alternate lifestyle. Now, we talk about this and, the 72% and being verbally insulted and that sort of thing. I know that there were people who were physically assaulted. I know that some people would wait outside, say they were drinking at Zeno's, which is right around the corner. They'd wait in front of the corner room, which is a few doors down from Chumley's. And they'd wait till last call, and they'd wait for people to leave and follow them and taunt them and eventually beat them. I know because I was one of those people. I did the beating. I did this because I wanted to show my manhood. I knew what was inside of me, but I was hiding. I was hiding it deep inside of me. And it's to my shame that I did this. Now, I tracked down all that I could of the people who I did this to, and I wasn't alone. I was never alone doing this. And I made it right with them as best I can. I mean, what can you do for someone who just because of the way they live are being taunted? Well, I've learned that myself now. I've been on the other side. And again, I'm very ashamed. Now, Anthony D'Augili, he's a PhD, Penn State, and he did that survey that we've been talking about. He was also the advisor for the Penn State Lesbian Gay Student Alliance during the 1980s. Now, his paper, as you can see, Lesbian Gay Experiences in a University Committee, was the paper that was about Penn State. Again, nearly 3/4 experiencing verbal abuse, 26% threatened with violence, 17 had personal property damage, and their roommates were most often responsible for this. They found out the roommate was gay. Oh, ouch. Most incidents were not reported. Why? Because he didn't want to be outed. That'd be the worst possible thing. They would change their daily routines. They would not meet with other gay students in public. They would take different ways home. They would wait inside Chumley's for people to leave, or they would make sure that they're not walking alone. Over half of the sample feared for their personal safety, and the fear was related to the amount of harassment and previous property damage. Now, men were victimized more than women. He talks a bit about that in his paper, in that if you think back, men's attitudes in the 80s were, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but they were rather Neanderthal. And the idea of lesbians, guys loved that because they thought they could change them. So, but yes, gay men got beaten. They were threatened. but what really gets me in this, it wasn't reported because of that fear. That fear is what I'm studying here at Penn State, but from the transgender angle. What was it like being transgender in the 1980s? Well, as I said, for me, I was in hiding. I knew it was inside of me, but I was denying it myself. Now, there's a picture there of an apartment building. That is Beaver Hill. It's still here, but that view is no longer, because there's so many high rises in front of you, you can barely see it. There's a story that went around after Halloween '86. And that story was, there was an apartment party in Beaver Hill. And one of the people who lived in the apartment was a gay man. He was apparently very, very skilled at making himself look like a woman. Now, back then we figured that was drag, but he was very realistic apparently. And at a Halloween party, he went as a girl and he got picked up by one of the football team. Penn State's football team, again, national champions. We're talking guys who were pretty big. And then they left together. The story always ends there. And the assumption is when that football player found out that she was a he, that a beating would ensue. It was a given. I asked Dr. Augelli about transgender in the 1980s, and you can see what he answered to me. As advisor to the student group for more than a decade, I would have known about bias, etc., directed toward transgender students, but I knew of none. I didn't even know of trans students at all at that point. They were certainly invisible if they were on campus at all. Well, there were some here. And there's some truth to that story about Beaver Hill, but not the ending you thought it was. Because that quote unquote football player, oh yes, he was a football player, but he was also trans. And what they did all night was talk. He wanted to know what it meant to be trans and that sort of thing. I was trans. I have met 3 people of my generation who are out trans people. Now, with transgender people, again, somewhere between 1% and 3% of the population, only 1% of us transition. Most survive by either cross-dressing or whatever. But only 1% of us transition. Now, I'm going to throw up some numbers in a little bit. But for those who are curious, at the bottom, that's a picture of me in 1986. And that is also me. That was a month ago. So in one picture, I'm not smiling. In the other, I am. Well, there's a reason for that. I was never happy back in the 80s. I was so busy trying to be a man. I was a fraternity man. I was rough and tumble. In my fraternity, there were some gay men. There were some I suspected of being gay. There was one that I knew was bisexual. However, you didn't talk about it. The person who was bisexual, he was razzed about it hard. However, people grow up. People mature. One of the people who I didn't expect was gay and he married his partner some years ago. And brothers from our time serenaded him and his husband using one of our fraternity songs, but changing it from girl to boy. That to me says that if our people from my time and my fraternity can do that, can learn, anyone can learn. What is it like today? This has been gloom and doom the whole time. I mentioned that maybe 1% to 3%. So I knew 3, that'd be about right for people out as trans. But today we have the Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity. Eric, how long has that been around?
We've been around for since about 2000, 2001 in different iterations.
20 years. There's pride now here. There's resources for transgender and non-binary. There's a church downtown who is welcoming. We discuss race in queer spaces. Right now at Penn State University Park, there's 46,723 students. That means 4,600 LGB and 467 T. They don't have to live in fear anymore. They don't have to worry about someone following them home just out of pure hate. They don't have to worry about their roommates destroying things. Well, they do, but now they can report it and something will be done, unlike before. Times change, people change. Now, we are in a time now where there's backlash against the LGBT, especially the trans people. We will get through it. We made strides over the decades, especially trans people. For lesbian, gays, bisexual, there's now same-sex partner marriage. That's constitutional. It's there. That's not going away. We as a people have advanced. And there's no reason why we can't keep going. Hopefully, someday, we won't need a Penn State Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity because it will be a given. Hopefully, people won't have to hide their sexual or gender identity as I did, as those people, those thousands of people had to do back in the 80s. Hiding who you truly are is hell. I don't have to tell a lot of you that, but it is. There's a high suicide rate for LGBT, for kids. And there's, again, it's because it is hell. But thanks to programs here at Penn State and through the country, it's no longer hell. Okay, I've rambled. There's the Pride line again. Does anybody have any questions for me, for anyone else? I'm going to just point out that, yes, I have sources all over the place. And there you go.